What's the Pope's strategy in his travel choices? What does it say about his pontificate? Who better to ask than our next guest, Francis Rocca. Frank has been covering the Vatican for nearly 2 decades, the last 8 years as the Vatican Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Frank, it's so great to have you here with us. Despite his age and mobility problems, Pope Francis has packed in a tremendous amount of travel in just 10 years. What's the overall strategy regarding which countries are selected for these papal visits?
Well, he said this week as he was flying back from South Sudan, speaking to the reporters on the plane, he said, the criterion is I choose to visit the smallest countries. People will say, but he went to France. No, I went to Strasbourg. I will go to Marseille, not to France. The little ones, the little ones. He said the criterion is to get to know a little bit about the hidden Europe. He's talking about Europe in this case. That part of Europe that has so much culture but is not known, to accompany countries, for example, Albania. My choice is not to try to fall into the globalization of indifference. And I think that applies more broadly to the whole world. He's chosen to go to often to countries that don't have large Catholic populations, countries that small, very poor countries, and to skip some of the more obvious countries. He still has not been to Spain, which is remarkable given Spain's importance in the Catholic Church and the fact that he's from Latin America and the fact that he's a Jesuit, which is an order founded by a Spanish saint. So he hasn't been to Spain and he hasn't been to Germany, but he has been to Albania, as he says, and he has been to Bosnia, and he's talking about going to Mongolia.
Right, and in visiting these countries, she's also appointing leaders who are in these minority Catholic countries. So it's an interesting thing to watch as well. You were on his historic visit to Iraq in 2021 when he met with the Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani. Tell us about his outreach to the Muslim world.
Well, that's right. That's been a major theme of his papacy, of his pontificate. Absolutely. He's made a great friendship with the head of the rector of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, and as you mentioned, he met with a Shiite leader there in Iraq. That's been a big emphasis of his. That trip was also noteworthy because, of course, it's hard to remember now, but hardly anybody was traveling. This was early 2021, and people were afraid of COVID, and of course there was fear of violence there when we went on that trip, and all the security people said this is a high-risk trip, but he went anyway.
Absolutely. And so he's not afraid of high-risk trips, and he's not afraid to ask for mercy and to seek forgiveness. It's a big theme of his reconciliation, and he did last year in Canada when he was meeting with the indigenous population there. What does a visit like that tell us about his papacy?
Well, that was a remarkable trip because it was for anybody who's been on these things, on these papal trips, there's usually a sort of a joyous aspect, celebratory aspect, but this was very somber. He was there to apologize, and he did so over and over again. And certainly, obviously, members of the church were happy to see him, but the reception, even on local media, everyone was. It was an overall mood of skepticism, a real somber mood. I think the spectacle of the Pope in his wheelchair going there and saying he was sorry for the abuses of the indigenous peoples over the centuries, also in some cases with the participation of the Catholic Church, that I think that did have an impact, but it wasn't the usual joyous papal trip that you get, especially in Christian countries.
That's right, an image of great humility, but also with the dwindling Catholic population there's a reason that you might assume Canada would be a priority for him. Another place that is a priority, even though some like to say that he's at odds with this country, is the United States. He's visited the U.S. once, speaking to a joint session of Congress in 2015, and he has many friends, but also many vocal critics in the U.S. Do you think he'll come again? And do you think that he has some objectives in pastoring and being pastoral to the U.S. community?
Well, I doubt that he will come to the United States again. But then with this Pope, you never want to say never because he'll always surprise you. I think one thing that was interesting about that trip is he'd agreed to come for the World Meeting of Families. And then at the very close to the last minute, he tacked on Cuba. Cuba is actually the first stop, so it became a trip to Cuba and the United States. And he'd been instrumental, of course, in brokering an agreement between Cuba and the United States to improve their relations. But one couldn't help thinking that he was trying to remind the United States, too, you're not alone even in your hemisphere, and, you're part of a bigger picture.
Definitely trying to do that. And the Pope, and when you speak about Cuba, he's had different strategies in dealing with communism in Cuba and in China, as well as with the war in Ukraine. How would you characterize this papacy's outreach and approach to dictatorships?
Well, with Cuba, I mean, there was predictably some dissatisfaction and criticism when he didn't meet with dissidents there in Cuba, and he didn't criticize the regime more publicly for its treatment of dissidents. But you have to put it in perspective. I was there with Benedict in 2012, and there was the same criticism made at the same then, and I believe that happened when John Paul visited too in the late 90s. So the Vatican strategy has been with Cuba, and the bishop's strategy there has been not perhaps as aggressive as some people would like to defend the human rights issues there, and as Cuban dissidents would like. So with regard to China, of course, that's even more controversial. The Vatican has made a deal on the appointment of bishops, which basically shares that responsibility with the Chinese government, and some people say that hasn't worked out. There haven't been really hardly any bishops named under this new approach, under this new deal, just a few, and so some feel that perhaps it was a mistake. But the Pope's view clearly is that it's a long game, and he thinks this is going to be worthwhile in the end.
That's right, even though he has expressed some frustration in his dealings with China. Well, Frank, thank you so much for being with us and for clarifying this great legacy that I know we're going to be celebrating his decade as Pope in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.